Hey there. Imagine waking up one freezing morning in medieval Eastern Europe, only to find your village trapped under relentless snow and ice, with no way to escape the brutal cold. Winters back then weren't just cold, they were deadly. Entire villages vanished, wiped out by starvation, disease, and the merciless grip of winter. In today's video, we're diving deep into how these harsh winters killed thousands and reshaped life in medieval Eastern Europe. From frozen crops and dying livestock to the desperate acts people took to survive, this story is a chilling reminder of nature's power and the fragility of human life. We'll explore how isolation, hunger, and fear tore communities apart, and how faith and superstition influenced how people coped with the unimaginable. So if you're ready to uncover the grim reality behind those snowy landscapes and learn how winter shaped history, make sure you stick around. Don't forget to hit that like button if you find this story gripping, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's darkest moments. Let's get started and journey back to a time when winter could mean the end of everything. In the vast and varied lands of medieval Eastern Europe, winter was far more than a season. It was a force that shaped every aspect of life, a relentless adversary that tested the resilience of the villages nestled among forests, rivers, and plains. Understanding why these winters were so brutal requires us to first step back and look at the climate and geography that defined this region during the medieval period, roughly between the 5th and 15th centuries. This section will take you deep into the world of medieval winters, revealing the chilling environment that claimed entire villages and shaped the history and culture of Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe in the medieval era stretched across a vast area, encompassing what we now know as Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, parts of Russia, the Baltic states, and more. This sprawling territory was marked by diverse landscapes, dense forests like the primeval Bioiega, wide river plains such as those along the Dnieper and the Vistula, and mountain ranges like the Carpathians. Each region bore its own challenges, but they all shared one formidable commonality: winters that could be merciless. The climate of medieval Eastern Europe was influenced heavily by its continental position, far from the tempering effects of oceans and by the shifting patterns of the Northern Hemisphere's climate cycles. Unlike today's relatively stable conditions, the medieval period experienced notable fluctuations, including colder phases that historians and climatologists identify as part of the so-called Little Ice Age, a period of cooling that began around the 14th century and lasted for centuries. While the earliest parts of this cold phase appeared later, the medieval era was punctuated by harsh, unforgiving winters that were often long, bitter, and accompanied by heavy snowfalls and ice. Imagine a landscape gripped by months of sub-zero temperatures. Rivers froze solid enough to support the weight of people and horses. Forests stood silent under thick blankets of snow, and the days themselves shortened to only a few hours of pale sunlight. The sun, low in the sky, cast long shadows over fields hardened by frost. Villagers huddled in their timber or mud brick homes, burning scarce firewood to chase away the penetrating cold that seeped through every crack. The brutality of medieval winters was heightened by the lack of modern technology or infrastructure. Unlike today, there were no insulated homes, central heating systems, or weather forecasts to prepare communities for impending cold snaps. Villages were isolated, often self-sufficient, relying on the land and their stored resources to survive. When winter struck, it was a siege, a prolonged assault that cut off access to food, limited mobility, and made even basic survival a challenge. Geography played a crucial role in how different areas endured the cold. The vast river systems, vital for transport and trade during the warmer months, became obstacles as they froze, severing vital supply lines. Mountainous regions faced additional perils: avalanches, freezing temperatures amplified by altitude, and limited arable land that meant fewer stored crops to survive the winter. In the open plains and steppe regions, Fierce winds swept across the snow-covered ground, creating blizzards that reduced visibility to near zero. These winds could whip through villages, carrying snow that drifted into thick walls, blocking doors and windows. The biting cold was relentless and unyielding. Villagers were intimately aware of these dangers, having lived for generations with the rhythms of the seasons. Medieval Eastern Europe was an agricultural society deeply connected to the land. People planted crops in spring, tended fields in summer, and harvested before autumn's chill. But winter brought a forced pause. The frozen earth was barren, and food had to come from the stores saved during the warmer months. This dependence on stored food meant that the length and severity of winter could mean the difference between survival and starvation. A long, harsh winter drained supplies quickly. If the cold extended unexpectedly or was harsher than usual, it could destroy hopes of making it through. Crops that failed to mature before the first frost were lost, and animals weakened by cold and lack of fodder could die in large numbers, further diminishing food sources. Beyond the physical environment, the social and political landscape of medieval Eastern Europe added to the vulnerability of villages. Many areas were on the frontier of competing kingdoms, principalities, or tribal lands. Warfare, raids, and political instability often disrupted farming and trade, leaving communities with fewer resources when winter arrived. Fortifications were sparse in rural areas, meaning that during winter, when armies also struggled with supply and mobility, villages were often left defenseless and isolated. Medical knowledge was limited, and the harsh winter conditions aggravated the spread of disease. Cold weakened immune systems, and cramped, poorly heated homes became breeding grounds for illnesses like pneumonia and typhus. The lack of clean water, due to freezing streams and wells, increased the risk of infection. Religion and superstition played a significant role in how medieval Eastern Europeans understood and coped with these brutal winters. Harsh winters were often interpreted as divine punishment or signs of impending doom. Villagers turned to prayers, rituals, and festivals to seek protection and favor. Yet such beliefs, while providing psychological comfort, could not stave off hunger or cold. All of these factors combined to create a winter that was not simply cold but existentially threatening. Medieval Eastern Europeans did not just endure winter. They fought a relentless battle for survival. Entire villages, bound by kinship and shared hardship, could be wiped out by a single season's relentless cold and deprivation. To appreciate the severity of these winters, we must consider the technology and resources available. Heating was primitive, mainly open hearths burning wood or charcoal. Insulation was minimal, and clothing, while layered, could not fully protect against the cold's sting. Food preservation methods like salting or drying helped but were limited by available supplies. When food ran low and the cold was unrelenting, the fragile web sustaining life began to unravel. Thus, the stage was set for tragedy. A brutal winter could isolate a village, destroy crops and livestock, bring disease and despair, and ultimately lead to the death of many or all its inhabitants. In the chapters ahead, we will explore these factors in greater detail, how the cold transformed the land, destroyed food supplies, and pushed villagers to the brink. But here, in this first section, we lay the foundation. The climate and geography of medieval Eastern Europe created winters that were among the deadliest forces of nature, shaping not only the lives of individuals, but the course of history itself. The unforgiving grip of medieval Eastern Europe's brutal winters extended far beyond the villages themselves, seizing the very landscape and transforming once familiar, fertile lands into inhospitable, frozen wastelands. To understand how entire communities were devastated by winter's wrath, we must first explore how the extreme cold reshaped rivers, forests, and farmland, the essential elements that sustained life. The transformation of the environment under ice and snow was not just a backdrop, but an active force of destruction that left villagers trapped in a frozen world of scarcity and danger. Eastern Europe's rivers, the lifeblood of medieval settlements, became one of the first casualties of winter's advance. Normally flowing freely, these waterways supported fishing, transportation, and irrigation. However, as temperatures plunged, rivers and streams froze solid, sometimes to depths several feet thick. This freezing was not merely a surface phenomenon. Sustained cold locked rivers in ice for months, disrupting the entire ecological system. Fish, a vital protein source, struggled to survive beneath the ice, and ice-covered rivers cut off trade and communication routes. The frozen rivers also had a psychological effect on the inhabitants. For people accustomed to following the flow of these waterways for travel and trade, the sudden immobilization of rivers was a stark reminder of their isolation. Ferries stopped, boats remained docked, and supply lines dwindled. For villages dependent on these water routes for essential goods, the freeze meant starvation was just one step closer. Forests, which covered vast swaths of medieval Eastern Europe, underwent traumatic transformation under the cold. The trees, cloaked in frost and heavy snow, seemed to hibernate, but beneath the surface, the environment became hostile. Thick snow compacted over the forest floor, crushing underbrush and making it difficult for animals to forage. Many wildlife species that villagers relied upon for food, deer, boar, rabbits migrated, hibernated deeply, or perished in large numbers. Hunting, a crucial supplement to farming, became near impossible. The cold also weakened trees themselves. Heavy ice storms broke branches and toppled weakened trunks, reducing available firewood in a time when warmth meant survival. The damage to forests was felt acutely by villagers who relied on wood not just for heating, but also for building and repairing homes and tools. The scarcity of fuel added a layer of urgency and desperation. Farmland, the heart of medieval village survival, bore perhaps the harshest transformation under winter's rule. Once lush and fertile, fields turned into frozen expanses, the soil hard as stone beneath a thick crust of ice and snow. Crops that had survived the early frost were crushed under the weight of snow, and seeds sown in autumn failed to germinate in the bitter cold. The soil itself lost its life-giving qualities, locked away from sunlight and warmth, making spring planting a gamble on the mercy of the seasons. Snow cover, while insulating to a degree, also created challenges. Deep snowdrifts could bury fields entirely, and thawing and freezing cycles led to soil erosion and the destruction of early growth. Melting snow often flooded fields, washing away precious topsoil or drowning overwintering plants. These environmental damages created a domino effect, resulting in poor harvests and food shortages that imperiled entire villages. The environmental transformation was not uniform. Local geography and climate patterns created variations. Mountainous areas faced avalanches and dangerous ice buildup, while lowland plains suffered from blizzards and drifts. Some areas experienced prolonged freeze-thaw cycles, which exacerbated soil damage and disrupted traditional farming schedules. Villagers, keen observers of the land, understood the signs of environmental change, but their options were limited. They stored what they could during autumn harvests, but the length and severity of the winter often outpaced their preparations. The natural world, so vital to their survival, seemed to turn against them, creating an almost alien landscape that no longer yielded the life-sustaining gifts they depended on. Water sources beyond rivers, wells, springs, and ponds also froze, complicating access to fresh water. Thawed snow and ice sometimes provided water, but contamination risk increased as stagnant pools formed. The scarcity of clean water contributed to the spread of disease and weakened villagers physically. The frozen landscape also affected mobility. Thick ice and snow made travel treacherous or impossible. Roads and paths vanished beneath drifts, and villagers were often confined to their homes or immediate surroundings. Trade and communication with neighboring villages ceased, cutting off vital supplies and news. The isolation magnified the sense of despair and vulnerability. Animals crucial to survival suffered similarly. Livestock faced starvation and freezing conditions. Farmers struggled to provide fodder, which was often in short supply due to the poor harvests of previous months. Many animals perished, removing a critical source of food, labor, and income. The loss of livestock was a blow from which many villages never recovered. The environmental impact extended into the village itself. Snow and ice infiltrated homes. Roofs collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and frozen ground made repairs and maintenance nearly impossible. The very shelter that should have provided protection became fragile. Despite these harsh transformations, the medieval inhabitants developed strategies to cope. Some cleared snow from roofs, built windbreaks, and created storehouses designed to protect food and firewood from moisture and freezing. Villages often stored dried foods, salted meat, and grains carefully, understanding that these resources would be their lifeline. However, when winter stretched too long or was particularly severe, these measures fell short. The frozen landscape was not just a physical challenge. It also shaped cultural perceptions. Winter was often personified as a cruel force or a test of endurance. Folklore and stories reflected the hostility of the environment, warning of spirits or curses in the icy wilderness. These beliefs reinforced communal bonds, encouraging cooperation and shared sacrifice as ways to survive the relentless cold. In some, medieval Eastern Europe's frozen landscapes were battlegrounds themselves, places where cold and ice waged war on the natural world and human settlements. Rivers froze, cutting lifelines. Forests became silent and scarce in resources, and farmlands transformed into barren fields covered in ice and snow. This environmental transformation was a key reason why winters were so deadly. It stripped away the essentials of life, isolating villages and setting the stage for famine, disease, and death. The story of frozen landscapes is one of resilience amid despair. It is about how humans struggled not only against each other, but against nature's most ruthless season. As we move forward, we'll see how these environmental changes translated directly into the hardships experienced by medieval villagers, how the frozen world shaped every struggle for survival in the dead of winter. Before the icy grip of winter transformed the landscape into a frozen wasteland, medieval Eastern European villages thrived on a delicate balance of nature, labor, and community. Life followed the steady rhythm of the seasons cycle that shaped every activity, decision, and hope of the villagers. To understand the devastating impact of winter and how it killed entire communities, we must first look at the fragile world that existed before the freeze, where survival depended on the harmony between people and the land. Villages in medieval Eastern Europe were typically small, close-knit communities surrounded by fields, pastures, and forests. The architecture was simple wooden or clay-walled houses with thatched or shingled roofs, often grouped along a central road or near a water source. Within these modest homes, multiple generations lived under one roof, sharing space and labor. The village was a social and economic unit where cooperation was essential. The heartbeat of village life was agriculture. Most villagers were peasants who worked the land, growing grains like rye, barley, oats, and wheat. These crops formed the foundation of their diet, providing bread and porridge that sustained them through the year. Alongside crops, livestock such as cows, sheep, pigs, and chickens played a vital role, supplying meat, milk, wool, and eggs. The work year was cyclical, with distinct seasons dictating the tasks ahead. Spring marked the beginning of planting, when the soil thawed and became ready to receive seeds. Villagers prepared fields by clearing debris, tilling the earth with plows pulled by oxen or horses, and carefully sowing crops. Spring was also a time for repairing tools and buildings damaged by winter. Summer brought growth and hard work under the sun. Farmers tended to crops, weeding and irrigating when possible. Livestock needed constant care, feeding, watering, and protection from predators. Children helped with chores, while women spun wool and wove cloth. The community often gathered for celebrations, sharing food and stories to mark the changing seasons. Harvest in late summer and early autumn was a critical time. Villagers worked tirelessly to reap grains before the first frosts arrived. The harvest determined whether a family or village could store enough food to survive the coming winter. Grain was threshed to separate kernels from stalks, then dried and stored in granaries or cellars designed to keep it safe from moisture and pests. Beyond farming, villagers relied on the forest for wood, game, berries, and herbs. Wood was essential not only for building, but also for heating and cooking. Hunting supplemented the diet, especially in regions where agriculture was more difficult. Fishing in nearby rivers and lakes provided additional sustenance. Water, sourced from wells, springs, or streams, was vital for drinking, cooking, and washing. Maintaining clean water sources was a community responsibility, as contamination could lead to illness. Daily life followed routines shaped by light and weather. Men typically rose early to work fields or tend animals. Women prepared food, cared for children, and managed household tasks. Evenings were spent around the hearth, where families gathered for warmth and storytelling. The church was central to village life, marking time with festivals, masses, and holy days. This interconnected system was fragile. Success depended on favorable weather, healthy crops, and the absence of disease. A late frost in spring or early freeze in autumn could devastate planting or harvesting. Poor soil, drought, or floods could reduce yields. Livestock illness or predation threatened food security. Villagers developed customs and knowledge to navigate these risks. They observed natural signs, bird migrations, plant blooming, cloud patterns to anticipate changes. Shared wisdom passed down through generations guided planting and harvesting. Community cooperation ensured that no one faced hardship alone. Yet, this balance was always precarious. The changing seasons brought promise and peril. Winter was the final test. It demanded sufficient stored food, adequate shelter, and warmth. Failure to prepare meant suffering. The economy of the village was largely subsistence-based, but trade played a role. Surpluses were exchanged for goods like salt, tools, or textiles. Markets in nearby towns connected villages to broader networks, though these links often faltered in winter. Social structure influenced life too. Lords or nobles might control land, collecting taxes or labor. Peasants owed obligations, but relied on the land for survival. The church held spiritual and sometimes political power, influencing daily routines and festivals. Education was limited, with most knowledge practical and oral. Literacy was rare, mainly among clergy or nobles. Folklore and religious beliefs intertwined, shaping how villagers understood the world, including the seasons and the hardships they faced. Children learned early the skills needed for village life farming, crafting, animal care. Work began young, preparing them to contribute to family and community. Festivals and rituals punctuated the year, offering relief from labor and reinforcing bonds. Celebrations like harvest festivals or saints' days blended joy with prayers for protection and prosperity. Before the freeze, the landscape was alive and productive. Fields yielded crops, forests teemed with game, rivers flowed with fish. The village was a place of constant activity, hope, and interdependence. But beneath this vitality lay vulnerability. The reliance on nature's rhythms meant that any disruption, drought, flood, pestilence, or cold could unravel the fragile web sustaining life. When winter finally arrived, it shattered this balance. Food stores dwindled, animals weakened, and the once bustling village slowed to a precarious standstill. Understanding this fragile balance helps us grasp the profound impact of medieval winters. They were not just a cold season, but a siege against life itself. The collapse of this delicate system led to starvation, disease, and death on a scale that could extinguish entire villages. As we continue, we will see how the rhythms of village life were violently interrupted by the freeze, setting the stage for a harsh and often deadly winter. The arrival of winter in medieval Eastern Europe was never a sudden event. It crept in gradually, whispering warnings through the shifting weather and changing landscapes. For villagers living in this fragile balance, the onset of winter was a critical time, a period of transition marked by both preparation and uncertainty. Yet despite the signs, many communities underestimated the severity of the coming season. The first signs of trouble were easy to overlook, masked by the routine of daily life and the hope that the worst could be avoided. This section explores how the early days of winter disrupted food supplies, water access, and mobility, and how these initial challenges set the stage for deeper suffering. As autumn waned, subtle changes in temperature, daylight, and wildlife behavior began to signal that winter's grasp was tightening. The crisp, golden days of harvest gave way to gray skies and biting winds. Villagers noticed shorter daylight hours, and the sun's warmth diminished, barely rising above the horizon. This seasonal shift affected crops still in the fields, livestock grazing patterns, and the availability of wild foods. Some villagers observed migrating birds departing earlier than usual, or animals seeking shelter sooner, signs that harsher weather was imminent. Despite these warnings, the demands of harvest and daily labor often masked the true danger. Farmers raced to gather the remaining crops and prepare fodder for animals, sometimes pushing the limits of what the land and weather would allow. Fields became battlegrounds against frost, and late-planted grains risked failure. This tension between hope and fear marked the fragile days before winter fully descended. One of the first major disruptions caused by the onset of winter was to food supplies. Though much of the harvest had been gathered, the quality and quantity of stored food were uncertain. Early frosts could damage root vegetables or grains left in the ground too long. In years of poor harvest, stores were already thin, and the first signs of crop failure caused alarm. Villagers had to ration carefully, yet scarcity was often not fully acknowledged until it was too late. Water access also became problematic as temperatures dropped. Wells and springs, essential for drinking and cooking, began to freeze at their surfaces. In some areas, rivers and streams slowed or iced over, making it difficult to collect fresh water. Villagers learned to break ice carefully or collect melted snow, but these methods were time-consuming and never entirely reliable. The cold also increased the risk of water contamination, leading to illness. Mobility was the third critical area affected by winter's onset. Muddy roads and paths that had become quagmires in autumn began to freeze and harden, initially easing travel, but soon becoming treacherously icy. As snowfall began, movement slowed further. Villagers found it harder to reach neighbors, markets, or forests. For isolated settlements, this reduced contact heightened vulnerability, cutting off access to trade, news, and assistance. Despite these challenges, many villagers clung to routines and traditions that delayed full recognition of winter's severity. Celebrations marking the end of harvest feasts, fairs, religious ceremonies continued, providing psychological comfort and a sense of community. Such events helped maintain morale, but also diverted attention from looming dangers. Communication of winter's severity was limited. Without modern weather forecasts or widespread literacy, information passed through word of mouth, often colored by hope or denial. Some elders or experienced villagers warned of a harsh season based on natural signs, but younger or less experienced members sometimes dismissed these cautions. Early illnesses appeared during this transitional period. The drop in temperature, combined with poor nutrition and fatigue from harvest labor, weakened immune systems. Respiratory infections, colds, and fevers began to spread. Medical remedies were rudimentary, and superstition often filled the gaps, with prayers or charms used to ward off sickness. Livestock showed early signs of distress. Grazing became difficult as grass died or was covered in frost. Animals grew weaker and more susceptible to disease. Farmers scrambled to provide stored fodder, but supplies were limited. The loss of even a few animals was significant, threatening future food and labor capacity. The environment itself betrayed subtle warnings. Frozen ground cracked, trees lost leaves earlier than normal, and snowfalls became more frequent. Yet nature's signs were not always reliable predictors. Some years brought early but mild winters. Others, brutal and prolonged cold. This unpredictability made preparation difficult. Villagers who depended on hunting and gathering faced similar uncertainties. The availability of game declined as animals either migrated or entered hibernation. Foraging for wild fruits and nuts became impossible as plants withered. This loss further strained food resources. The psychological impact of these early troubles was profound. Anxiety grew as food stores dwindled and cold set in. Families began to worry about their children and elders, whose health was more fragile. The community's collective spirit was tested as individuals coped with fear, frustration, and the burden of survival. Yet, despite these warnings and hardships, some villagers underestimated winter's threat. Perhaps it was human nature to hope for relief, or a reluctance to face grim realities. In some cases, social pressures discouraged panic, as maintaining calm was seen as essential for communal cohesion. Preparations continued as best as possible. Villagers sealed homes against drafts, gathered firewood, and stored food in cellars or granaries. Women and children spun wool, sewed clothing, and repaired blankets. These efforts, though vital, could not fully offset the challenges. The onset of winter also revealed inequalities within villages. Wealthier families often had better stores, stronger homes, and more livestock, increasing their chances of survival. Poorer families struggled, sometimes relying on charity or communal support. These disparities sometimes bred tension, jealousy, or conflict. Religious institutions played a role during this period. Churches offered spiritual guidance and sometimes material aid. Priests urged prayer and repentance, interpreting winter's hardships as divine tests or punishment. Religious festivals continued, offering hope and social connection. In some regions, local leaders attempted to organize relief or rationing, but resources were limited. The administrative capacity to respond to crisis was minimal, especially in rural areas far from centers of power. Trade, vital for supplementing local resources, declined sharply. Roads became impassable, markets closed, and merchants ceased operations until spring. This economic freeze compounded shortages. Despite all, the community's resilience shone through small acts of kindness, sharing firewood, helping neighbors repair homes, or caring for the sick. These bonds were essential for psychological survival and practical support. However, as the first full cold spells arrived, it became clear that early troubles were only the beginning. Food stores would not last indefinitely. Water sources would freeze harder, and movement would become nearly impossible. The fragile balance was tipping toward crisis. The onset of winter was a crucial period of adjustment and testing. How well a village prepared, how closely it heeded the early warnings, and how strong its social fabric was could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. As we move forward, we will see how these first signs of trouble deepened into full-blown disaster, how frozen landscapes, scarcity, and isolation overwhelmed even the most prepared communities. The onset of winter was the opening chapter in a story of endurance, despair, and the ultimate test of human will against the relentless cold. The survival of medieval Eastern European villages hinged on the success of their crops. Each year, farmers planted, tended, and harvested their fields with the hope that the land would provide enough food to sustain them through the long winter months. But when brutal winters arrived with freezing temperatures and heavy snow, they brought devastation to these vital crops and turned once fertile fields into barren, starving landscapes. This section delves into the destruction wrought by frost and snow on medieval crops, revealing how this natural assault triggered widespread food shortages that threatened entire communities. In the agricultural cycle of medieval Eastern Europe, timing was everything. Crops such as rye, wheat, barley, and oats required careful planting in spring and nurturing throughout the summer. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were planted to mature by autumn. Farmers relied on a delicate window between the last spring frost and the first autumn frost to complete their harvest. Any disruption to this rhythm could spell disaster. Frost was the enemy farmers feared most. Early or unexpected frosts in autumn could kill plants before they reached maturity, stunting grains and wilting root vegetables still in the ground. Even hardy crops, though resistant to light frost, could not withstand prolonged freezing. When frost penetrated the soil, it damaged root systems, killing seedlings and destroying stored nutrients. These losses translated directly into less food for villagers. The onset of heavy snow further compounded this destruction. While snow can act as an insulating blanket, protecting some plants from extreme cold, medieval farmers often faced situations where snow was too deep or arrived too early. Thick layers of snow crushed stalks, prevented sunlight from reaching crops, and soaked the soil, causing rot during brief thaws. The alternating cycles of freezing and thawing weakened soil structure, washed away topsoil, and damaged perennial plants and pastures. The destruction of crops was not uniform. Some fields fared slightly better due to microclimates, soil quality, or protective forest windbreaks, but many were decimated. Those in low-lying, frost-prone areas suffered heavily. Fields on slopes or exposed plains were vulnerable to cold winds and snow accumulation. These environmental challenges were made worse by limited agricultural technology. Plowing was done by hand or with simple wooden plows, and irrigation was minimal. Without advanced drainage systems, fields prone to flooding were vulnerable to waterlogging and ice damage. Crop rotation and soil enrichment were practiced but limited by knowledge and resources. The failure of crops was felt immediately by villagers. Grain was the cornerstone of food use to make bread, porridge, and ale. When yields fell short, families faced hunger. Stored grain, salted meat, and dried vegetables had to be rationed carefully. Without adequate reserves, starvation loomed. Livestock, dependent on these crops for fodder, also suffered. Reduced harvests meant less feed, leading to weakened animals, decreased milk and meat production, and in some cases, death. The loss of animals removed critical sources of nutrition and labor, deepening the crisis. The economic consequences extended beyond immediate survival. Surpluses that villagers might sell or trade vanished, reducing income and access to goods. Local markets shrank as food became scarce and prices rose. This economic contraction heightened tensions within and between communities. The psychological impact of failing crops was profound. The hope built during spring and summer turned to fear and despair as fields yielded less. Elders and farmers experienced deep anxiety, knowing the winter ahead could be unforgiving. Stories of past bad harvests and famines circulated, creating a shared sense of dread. Coping strategies varied. Some villagers attempted to supplement diets with wild plants, roots, and bark. Hunting increased, though wildlife was also stressed by winter conditions. Fishing, where possible, provided some relief, but frozen rivers limited access. Communal efforts sometimes emerged to support the most vulnerable. Sharing of food, collective hunting, or pooling of resources were attempts to stave off starvation. However, these efforts were often insufficient in the face of widespread crop failure. Religious institutions played a role during times of scarcity. Prayers, fasts and processions were organized, seeking divine intervention. Churches might distribute alms or organize grain storage. Yet faith alone could not prevent the tangible effects of frozen fields. Natural disasters sometimes compounded the problem. Late autumn storms, hail, or heavy rains could ruin harvests just before winter. Pests, though less active and cold, could still damage crops earlier in the season. The cumulative effect was a precarious food situation. The destruction of crops also influenced social dynamics. Wealthier landowners who controlled larger, more fertile estates sometimes managed to maintain supplies, while poorer peasants suffered disproportionately. This disparity sometimes fueled unrest, blame, or resentment within villages. Documentation from the period, including chronicles and letters, paints a grim picture of harvest failures. Reports of empty granaries, starving families, and abandoned fields illustrate the scale of the crisis. Some villages were so devastated that they never fully recovered. The link between frozen crops and starvation was direct and deadly. Without food, malnutrition set in, weakening bodies and making people more susceptible to disease. Children, the elderly, and the infirm were especially vulnerable. Deaths from starvation and related illnesses rose sharply during harsh winters. Survival often depended on luck finding a small cache of preserved food, receiving help from neighbors, or having access to alternative food sources. The brutal winter tested every individual and community, exposing the limits of human endurance. The story of frozen crops and starving fields is one of nature's power to disrupt human life at its core. The failure of the land to provide food threatened the very existence of villages and forced hard choices, whether to migrate, share limited resources, or face starvation. As the fields lay barren beneath ice and snow, the medieval villagers faced a cruel reality. Their lifeblood was gone. The coming months would be a battle against hunger and cold, with survival uncertain. In the following sections, we will explore how these food shortages interacted with disease, social unrest, and the harsh environment to create a perfect storm of tragedy for medieval Eastern European communities. In medieval Eastern Europe, firewood and fuel were the lifelines that separated life from death during the brutal winters. The struggle to gather, store, and conserve enough fuel to keep homes warm was a constant battle for villagers. When these essential resources ran low or disappeared, the consequences were dire homes grew cold, food spoiled, and human health deteriorated. This section explores the critical importance of firewood and fuel in medieval village life, the challenges villagers faced in securing them, and the grim realities when scarcity set in. For rural medieval communities, wood was the primary source of fuel. It heated homes, cooked meals, boiled water, and warmed bath water. The hearth was the heart of every household, a place of warmth and social gathering. Without fire, the cold seeped into bones, threatening hypothermia and frostbite. Gathering firewood was a labor-intensive task that required planning and cooperation. Villagers collected wood during the warmer months, cutting fallen branches, dead trees, or managing small woodlots. They stacked logs carefully to dry and season before winter, ensuring the wood burned efficiently. Gathering also included collecting smaller kindling twigs, bark, and brush to start fires. However, in harsh winters or poor years, the supply of available wood dwindled rapidly. Heavy snowfall and ice made forests difficult to access. Frozen ground hindered the use of carts or sleds for transport. Communities near depleted woodlands faced acute shortages. Demand for firewood increased sharply as temperatures dropped. Villagers burned wood, not just for comfort but survival. Keeping fires burning day and night required large quantities of fuel. Houses, often built from wood and straw, were drafty and poorly insulated, necessitating constant warmth. The scarcity of fuel forced villagers to make painful choices. Some rationed wood strictly, limiting fires to mealtimes or nighttime. Others resorted to burning furniture, tools, or even wooden parts of houses to stay warm. These measures, though desperate, were sometimes the only way to survive. Fuel scarcity also impacted food preservation. Without fire, cooking was impossible, and food supplies risked spoiling. Villagers could not boil water or prepare warm meals, which were critical for maintaining strength against the cold. Alternative fuel sources were scarce. Peat, a form of compressed organic material found in marshes, was used in some regions but required knowledge and access. Animal dung was occasionally dried and burned, but produced unpleasant smoke and limited heat. Charcoal was expensive and often reserved for blacksmiths or wealthy households. Communities attempted to conserve fuel through shared hearths or communal ovens, reducing the number of fires burning simultaneously. Such practices fostered cooperation, but also increased dependence and vulnerability. Social tensions sometimes arose over access to firewood. Wealthier families or village leaders might control woodland resources, leading to disputes or accusations of hoarding. Poorer households suffered the most, with limited means to procure or store fuel. Efforts to manage forests sustainably were limited. Medieval forestry practices varied, but in many areas overharvesting and population pressures depleted woodlands. Deforestation reduced the natural buffer against scarcity. The physical toll of gathering firewood in winter was severe. Cold, exhaustion, and injuries were common among woodcutters and carriers. Accidents involving sharp tools, falls, or hypothermia were risks. The lack of fuel also affected livestock shelters, which required warmth to protect animals from freezing. Without adequate bedding or heating, animals became more vulnerable to cold and disease, compounding food shortages. In some regions, authorities imposed restrictions or regulations on woodcutting to preserve resources. These laws sometimes sparked conflict or illegal harvesting. Enforcement was difficult, especially during hard times. Historical records detail years when entire villages faced fuel shortages, forcing desperate measures. Chronicles speak of families huddling around small fires or using straw for warmth, underscoring the harsh realities of medieval winter survival. The psychological impact of cold, dark homes cannot be overstated. The hearth was not only a source of warmth, but a center of comfort and social life. Its absence deepened feelings of isolation and despair. Religious practices and festivals sometimes provided warmth and light through candles, torches, and communal gatherings, though these were minor compared to the need for firewood. As fuel ran out, villagers faced increased exposure to cold-related illnesses, frostbite, hypothermia, respiratory infections, all deadly in an era without modern medicine. The scarcity of firewood also influenced migration patterns. Some villagers chose to leave depleted or dangerously cold areas in search of better conditions, though travel in winter was perilous. In summary, the struggle for firewood and fuel was a battle fought alongside the cold itself. It was a race against time and nature, where failure meant frozen homes, starving fields, and shrinking chances of survival. The loss of fuel resources laid bare the vulnerabilities of medieval village life, demonstrating how a single scarcity could ripple through every aspect of existence, from health and food to social relations and mental well-being. In the coming sections, we will explore how these fuel shortages intertwined with disease outbreaks, social unrest, and survival strategies, painting a fuller picture of winter's deadly hold on medieval Eastern Europe. Medieval winters in Eastern Europe were more than just a test of endurance against cold and hunger. They were also a breeding ground for disease and malnutrition, twin killers that silently claimed countless lives. As temperatures dropped and food supplies dwindled, villagers' bodies grew weaker and their immune defenses faltered. The devastating impact of this weakness manifested in outbreaks of pneumonia, typhus, scurvy, and other illnesses that struck communities already battered by the harsh elements. This section explores how winter's relentless grip combined with starvation and poor living conditions to create a deadly synergy of disease and malnutrition. The human body requires nourishment and warmth to maintain its natural defenses against pathogens. When deprived of sufficient calories and nutrients, the immune system weakens, leaving individuals vulnerable to infections. Malnutrition in medieval villages was not a chronic problem, but became acute during brutal winters, especially after failed harvests and livestock losses. One of the most common killers during these winters was pneumonia, a respiratory infection exacerbated by cold and damp living conditions. The drafty, crowded houses typical of medieval villages were perfect incubators for airborne diseases. With limited means to control indoor temperature and humidity, villagers were exposed to chilling air and smoke from hearth fires, which irritated lungs and made infections more likely. Symptoms of pneumonia: coughing, fever, chest pain, and breathlessness were often fatal, especially for children, the elderly, and those already weakened by hunger. Medical knowledge at the time was minimal, and treatments were based on herbal remedies, bloodletting, or prayers, with little success. Typhus was another devastating disease, linked closely to the harsh conditions of winter and the poverty it caused. Spread by lice thriving in crowded, unsanitary living quarters, typhus caused high fevers, rashes, delirium, and often death. The lice infestation was almost unavoidable in villages where clothing was infrequently changed, and bathing was rare during freezing months. Poor hygiene combined with malnutrition created a vicious cycle. As villagers weakened, they were less able to maintain cleanliness or care for themselves and others. Contaminated water sources, limited waste disposal, and cramped homes facilitated the spread of bacterial and viral diseases. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was a hidden killer in winter. With fresh fruits and vegetables unavailable, and diets limited to stored grains and salted meats, villagers lacked essential nutrients. Scurvy led to fatigue, swollen gums, bleeding, and eventually death if untreated. Its symptoms were often confused with other illnesses or dismissed as weakness. Other common ailments included dysentery, caused by contaminated water and poor sanitation, leading to severe diarrhea and dehydration. Influenza and common colds were widespread and could turn fatal in weakened individuals. The psychological stress of cold, hunger, and isolation also compromised health. Chronic stress hormones suppress immune function, making infections more likely and recovery harder. Depression and despair were widespread, affecting both physical and mental well-being. The communal nature of medieval villages meant that disease spread quickly. Families shared living spaces, food, and tools, and communal gatherings for religious or social purposes facilitated transmission. Quarantine or isolation was rarely possible. Medical practitioners in medieval villages were few and often relied on traditional herbal medicines and superstitions. The lack of effective treatment meant that epidemics could wipe out large portions of a community. Religious interpretations of disease as punishment or divine will influence responses. Prayers, fasting, and rituals were common, providing psychological comfort but no real cure. Efforts to mitigate disease included attempts at cleanliness sweeping homes, fumigating with smoke, or using herbs believed to repel illness. Some villages organized care for the sick, though resources were limited. Malnutrition not only made disease worse, but also reduced fertility and increased infant mortality, affecting the long-term viability of communities. Historical records reveal the scale of suffering, with entire villages reduced to skeleton populations during severe winters. The combined effects of cold, hunger, and disease created cycles of decline and recovery that shaped medieval Eastern European history. Despite these challenges, some villagers survived through resilience, community support, and small acts of kindness. Sharing food, tending the ill, and maintaining hope were vital for endurance. As we move forward, we will examine how these health crises intertwined with social unrest, migration, and survival strategies, painting a fuller picture of the medieval winter struggle. The harsh winters of medieval Eastern Europe did not merely challenge survival through cold, hunger, and disease. They imposed a profound isolation upon the villages trapped beneath layers of snow and ice. This isolation was more than a physical barrier. It was a barrier to hope, aid, and connection to the wider world. Roads became impassable, communication lines severed, and trade routes blocked, cutting communities off from vital resources, medical assistance, and social support. The consequences of this isolation deepened the winter crisis, turning already desperate situations into near catastrophes. This section delves into the many facets of isolation caused by winter, exploring how it left entire communities trapped and vulnerable. To understand the full impact of winter isolation, one must first appreciate the medieval landscape and the nature of its transportation and communication systems. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, muddy in warmer months and treacherous or impassable when snowbound. Villages were scattered across forests, hills, and river valleys, connected by these fragile links. In the absence of modern infrastructure, travel depended on foot, horse, or simple carts vehicles that struggled through deep snow or frozen terrain. When heavy snowfall blanketed the countryside, these routes quickly vanished under white drifts. Icy winds and blizzards obscured landmarks, making navigation dangerous even for those familiar with the land. The risk of injury or death from exposure, starvation, or getting lost was real and immediate. The first signs of isolation would come early in winter, as small communities noted fewer travelers, messengers, and merchants arriving. As snow deepened and ice formed on rivers, the last connections to the outside world faded. Villagers' knowledge that their supplies would dwindle added to the growing dread. Trade was a lifeline for medieval villages. Markets provided goods impossible to produce locally: salt, spices, metals, cloth, and sometimes food staples. During winter, when local harvests were insufficient, trade became critical. Its collapse meant that shortages of essentials like grain or salt worsened sharply. Merchants and traders often avoided traveling in winter, fearing loss of goods, horses, or even their lives. Local roads filled with snow, bridges iced over, and fords became impassable. Rivers that once carried boats and rafts were frozen solid, blocking another crucial transportation channel. Religious institutions, often a source of charity and aid, were similarly cut off. Monasteries and churches in larger towns or cities could offer relief through stored grain or alms, but villagers trapped by snow could not reach them, nor could aid arrive in time. The isolation extended to medical assistance. Villagers relied on local healers or traveling physicians, who brought knowledge of herbs, rudimentary surgery, and care techniques. In winter, these practitioners could not travel safely. Without medical aid, treatable illnesses and injuries often became fatal. The isolation had psychological as well as physical effects. The knowledge of being cut off from friends, relatives, and the wider world created feelings of abandonment, despair, and hopelessness. Communication was limited to what could be done within the village walls. Villagers attempted to mitigate isolation through preparation and ingenuity. Stockpiling food, fuel, and medicines before winter was a standard practice, but these reserves were often insufficient during particularly harsh years. Community cooperation became essential, neighbors sharing resources, helping the weak, and maintaining morale. Messengers tried to brave the snowdrifts, sometimes traveling by sled or skis where available, but journeys were perilous. Failure to arrive with critical news or supplies could cost lives. Some villages located near mountain passes or rivers might be isolated for months. The lack of fresh food or medicine led to malnutrition and disease outbreaks, compounding winter's deadly effects. Isolation also affected governance and law enforcement. Officials could not visit, taxes went uncollected, and disputes simmered without resolution. This vacuum sometimes led to social unrest or crime. The vulnerability of isolated villages attracted opportunists such as bandits, who might prey on weakened communities, though winter conditions limited their activity too. Historical records tell of villages entirely cut off for entire seasons, forced to survive on minimal resources and facing near starvation. Some were abandoned or saw population declines as people migrated once conditions allowed. Despite these challenges, isolation also fostered strong community bonds. People depended on each other for survival, forging relationships that could last lifetimes. Shared hardship created a collective identity rooted in resilience. Folklore and stories often grew out of winter isolation, mixing fear with hope. Tales of spirits, miracles, and heroic endurance were passed down, providing comfort and meaning. In some cases, isolation delayed the spread of plagues or conflicts, ironically protecting certain communities, though this was a rare benefit. As winter ended and roads reopened, the return to connectedness was often joyful, but marked by loss. Families reunited, trade resumed, and aid arrived too late for many. The legacy of winter isolation shaped medieval Eastern European society. It influenced settlement patterns, with some villages relocating to less vulnerable areas or developing storage and fortification techniques. Isolation was a stark reminder of nature's power over human life. It underscored how survival depended not just on individual effort, but on connection and support from the wider world. This chapter of medieval history offers lessons about resilience and the human spirit when cut off from comfort and help. It shows how communities balanced hope and hardship, cooperation and survival. As we continue, we will explore how villagers coped socially and emotionally with the winter siege, and the strategies they used to endure isolation's heavy toll. The harsh winters of medieval Eastern Europe did not merely challenge survival through cold, hunger, and disease. They imposed a profound isolation upon the villages trapped beneath layers of snow and ice. This isolation was more than a physical barrier. It was a barrier to hope, aid, and connection to the wider world. Roads became impassable, communication lines severed, and trade routes blocked, cutting communities off from vital resources, medical assistance, and social support. The consequences of this isolation deepened the winter crisis, turning already desperate situations into near catastrophes. This section delves into the many facets of isolation caused by winter, exploring how it left entire communities trapped and vulnerable. To understand the full impact of winter isolation, one must first appreciate the medieval landscape and the nature of its transportation and communication systems. Roads were often little more than dirt paths, muddy in warmer months and treacherous or impassable when snowbound. Villages were scattered across forests, hills, and river valleys, connected by these fragile links. In the absence of modern infrastructure, travel depended on foot, horse, or simple carts vehicles that struggled through deep snow or frozen terrain. When heavy snowfall blanketed the countryside, these routes quickly vanished under white drifts. Icy winds and blizzards obscured landmarks, making navigation dangerous even for those familiar with the land. The risk of injury or death from exposure, starvation, or getting lost was real and immediate. The first signs of isolation would come early in winter, as small communities noted fewer travelers, messengers, and merchants arriving. As snow deepened and ice formed on rivers, the last connections to the outside world faded. Villagers' knowledge that their supplies would dwindle added to the growing dread. Trade was a lifeline for medieval villages. Markets provided goods impossible to produce locally: salt, spices, metals, cloth, and sometimes food staples. During winter, when local harvests were insufficient, trade became critical. Its collapse meant that shortages of essentials like grain or salt worsened sharply. Merchants and traders often avoided traveling in winter, fearing loss of goods, horses, or even their lives. Local roads filled with snow, bridges iced over, and fords became impassable. Rivers that once carried boats and rafts were frozen solid, blocking another crucial transportation channel. Religious institutions, often a source of charity and aid, were similarly cut off. Monasteries and churches in larger towns or cities could offer relief through stored grain or alms, but villagers trapped by snow could not reach them, nor could aid arrive in time. The isolation extended to medical assistance. Villagers relied on local healers or traveling physicians who brought knowledge of herbs, rudimentary surgery, and care techniques. In winter, these practitioners could not travel safely. Without medical aid, treatable illnesses and injuries often became fatal. The isolation had psychological as well as physical effects. The knowledge of being cut off from friends, relatives, and the wider world created feelings of abandonment, despair, and hopelessness. Communication was limited to what could be done within the village walls. Villagers attempted to mitigate isolation through preparation and ingenuity. Stockpiling food, fuel, and medicines before winter was a standard practice, but these reserves were often insufficient during particularly harsh years. Community cooperation became essential, neighbors sharing resources, helping the weak, and maintaining morale. Messengers tried to brave the snowdrifts, sometimes traveling by sled or skis where available, but journeys were perilous. Failure to arrive with critical news or supplies could cost lives. Some villages located near mountain passes or rivers might be isolated for months. The lack of fresh food or medicine led to malnutrition and disease outbreaks, compounding winter's deadly effects. Isolation also affected governance and law enforcement. Officials could not visit, taxes went uncollected, and disputes simmered without resolution. This vacuum sometimes led to social unrest or crime. The vulnerability of isolated villages attracted opportunists such as bandits, who might prey on weakened communities, though winter conditions limited their activity too. Historical records tell of villages entirely cut off for entire seasons, forced to survive on minimal resources and facing near starvation. Some were abandoned or saw population declines as people migrated once conditions allowed. Despite these challenges, isolation also fostered strong community bonds. People depended on each other for survival, forging relationships that could last lifetimes. Shared hardship created a collective identity rooted in resilience. Folklore and stories often grew out of winter isolation, mixing fear with hope. Tales of spirits, miracles, and heroic endurance were passed down, providing comfort and meaning. In some cases, isolation delayed the spread of plagues or conflicts, ironically protecting certain communities, though this was a rare benefit. As winter ended and roads reopened, the return to connectedness was often joyful, but marked by loss. Families reunited, trade resumed, and aid arrived too late for many. The legacy of winter isolation shaped medieval Eastern European society. It influenced settlement patterns, with some villages relocating to less vulnerable areas or developing storage and fortification techniques. Isolation was a stark reminder of nature's power over human life. It underscored how survival depended not just on individual effort, but on connection and support from the wider world. This chapter of medieval history offers lessons about resilience and the human spirit when cut off from comfort and help. It shows how communities balanced hope and hardship, cooperation and survival. As we continue, we will explore how villagers coped socially and emotionally with the winter siege, and the strategies they used to endure isolation's heavy toll. In the freezing heart of medieval Eastern Europe, famine was not merely a threat, it was a crushing reality that broke communities and pushed individuals to unimaginable desperation. When crops failed, livestock perished, and food stores vanished under the merciless grip of winter, hunger gnawed not just at stomachs, but at the very fabric of human dignity and morality. This section confronts the darkest consequences of famine. Abandonment of the vulnerable and documented cases of cannibalism acts born of survival instinct in a world where death was omnipresent and hope was fleeting. Famine in medieval times was more than just a scarcity of food. It was a siege upon life itself. When harvests failed, often due to harsh winters or earlier crop damage, entire villages faced starvation. Stored grains, dried foods, and preserved meats already carefully rationed were depleted rapidly. Livestock, once a source of meat, milk, and labor, were often consumed early or died from the cold and lack of forage, further stripping villagers of sustenance. The physical toll of famine was horrifying. People wasted away, their bodies becoming skeletal and fragile. Muscle and fat melted, and organs began to fail. The body's defenses collapsed, opening the door to disease and infection. Hunger-related conditions like scurvy, beriberi, and pellagra appeared as nutrient deficiencies ravaged populations. As famine tightened its grip, social order deteriorated rapidly. Families struggled to feed themselves, and the elderly, sick, and children, those least able to fend for themselves, were often the first to be abandoned or left to die. While these acts may seem cruel today, they were sometimes seen as tragic necessities in a world where resources were pitifully thin and survival chances slim. Historical accounts from chroniclers, letters, and court records paint a grim picture of abandonment. Parents faced the heart-wrenching decision to leave frail family members behind, hoping others might survive to carry on the lineage. Children were sent away to relatives, or even left in woods or by roadsides, a desperate bid to reduce mouths to feed. Yet famine's horror did not stop there. In the most extreme and desperate cases, communities and individuals resorted to cannibalism, a taboo act driven by the primal need to survive. Archaeological evidence, combined with written records from the medieval period, confirms that cannibalism occurred during severe famines, especially in besieged towns or isolated villages cut off from supplies. For many, cannibalism was unthinkable a last resort when death loomed nearer than starvation. It took different forms, scavenging from corpses, killing animals or even other humans for food, or in some rare instances, ritualistic cannibalism tied to superstition or beliefs. The trauma inflicted by these acts extended beyond the physical. Survivors bore psychological scars and social stigma. One notable historical episode was the famine following the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which affected much of Europe, but had echoes in Eastern Europe as well. Chroniclers described scenes of desperate crowds searching fields for roots and leaves, stealing from neighbors, and turning to cannibalism in cities besieged by hunger. While medieval laws condemned cannibalism as both sinful and criminal, enforcement was nearly impossible during widespread starvation. Cannibalism was sometimes connected to periods of siege warfare, where armies or populations trapped behind walls exhausted all food supplies. Villagers and soldiers alike faced starvation and death, and the lines between survival and morality blurred. Archaeological digs in such sites have uncovered human bones with cut marks consistent with butchery. The psychological toll on those involved in or witnessing cannibalism was profound. Survivors often recounted feelings of shame, horror, and guilt. Some historical texts suggest that communities buried these acts in silence, fearful of divine retribution or social ostracism. Famine and its darkest consequences also spurred social and religious upheaval. People questioned divine justice, blamed leaders, or sought scapegoats. Accusations of witchcraft or heresy sometimes arose, targeting marginalized groups accused of causing or benefiting from famine. The abandonment of vulnerable individuals reflected the harsh realities of medieval survival. With no formal welfare or social safety net, families and villages could not sustain all members. This led to difficult ethical dilemmas and tragic outcomes. Yet stories of compassion and sacrifice also emerged, neighbors sharing their last food, families caring for the sick despite the risk, and communities rallying to support each other. Chroniclers and historians have grappled with balancing the horror of famine and cannibalism against evidence of human resilience. It is important to recognize the context. Medieval people lived under constant threat from the elements, disease, and war. The choices made in famine were shaped by desperation rather than cruelty. The lasting legacy of famine and its darkest consequences shaped medieval society deeply. Population declines changed settlement patterns and economies. Social trauma lingered for generations, influencing folklore, religion, and cultural memory. In studying these grim chapters, we gain a fuller understanding of the human cost of survival under extreme conditions. We see how famine exposed the limits of endurance and forced people into decisions that challenge our modern moral frameworks. As the ice and snow eventually receded, villages faced the difficult task of rebuilding physically, socially, and spiritually. The memory of famine and cannibalism haunted survivors, but also strengthened the resolve to prepare better for future winters. In the merciless winters of medieval Eastern Europe, survival was a cruel lottery. For many villagers, the frozen death meant one fate: flight. When frost and famine made staying impossible, desperate families and communities chose to abandon their homes, braving the unknown in search of refuge, sustenance, and hope. This section explores the harrowing stories of survivors, the perilous journeys they undertook, the formation of migrating groups, and how these movements reshaped the social and demographic landscape of the region. Survival was rarely a solitary endeavor. Entire families, sometimes whole villages, packed what few possessions they could carry and set out into the bleak, snow-covered wilderness. The decision to leave was agonizing, a wrenching break from land, tradition, and the graves of ancestors. Yet remaining meant certain death by hunger, cold, or disease. The first challenge was preparation. Villagers gathered scant supplies, dried bread, salted meat, bits of cloth or blankets, and wrapped themselves in layers to fend off the biting cold. Elders and children were especially vulnerable, requiring extra care. Many left behind livestock or heavy belongings, choosing mobility or material comfort. As groups moved, the terrain itself became a relentless adversary. Frozen rivers and treacherous ice sheets posed dangers of collapse. Dense forests blocked paths and concealed threats. Snowstorms could separate members, leaving the lost to perish or wander aimlessly. Hunger stalked every step, forcing scavenging and rationing amid scarcity. Migration routes often followed ancient paths, trade routes, or rivers, hoping for settlements or hospitable territories. Travelers sought friendly villages, monasteries, or lordships offering food and shelter. But reception was mixed. Some communities welcomed survivors, sharing resources and protection. Others feared disease or competition and turned them away. The size and composition of migrating groups varied. Some were small family units, moving stealthily to avoid bandits or hostile neighbors. Others were larger caravans, with dozens or even hundreds traveling together for safety. These groups formed makeshift communities on the move, sharing labor, defense, and morale. Danger was ever present. Bandits exploited the chaos, raiding vulnerable migrants. Wolves and other predators attacked the weak. Exposure led to frostbite, hypothermia, and death. Illness spread quickly in cramped conditions. Many perished before reaching safety. Despite hardships, stories of courage and solidarity abound. Elders guided younger generations. Women tended the sick. Men cleared paths or hunted small game. Mutual aid was crucial to survival. Songs, prayers, and stories helped maintain hope amid despair. Historical records and archaeological evidence reveal traces of these migrations. Abandoned villages and cemeteries mark points of departure or tragedy. Monastic chronicles recount pilgrim-like journeys seeking sanctuary. Oral traditions preserve tales of lost kin and heroic escapes. These migrations had lasting demographic impacts. Regions receiving survivors sometimes experienced population growth and cultural blending, while depopulated areas faced economic and social decline. Land ownership shifted as abandoned farms reverted to wilderness or were claimed by others. Politically, mass movements strained local authorities. Lords struggled to accommodate influxes or maintain order. Some used migrants as labor or soldiers. Others imposed heavy taxes or restrictions. Refugee crises could spark tension or conflict between groups. The psychological toll on migrants was immense. Trauma from loss, fear of the unknown, and harsh conditions left deep scars. Yet survival also fostered resilience and adaptability. Communities forged new identities and social networks in their adopted homes. Migration stories also intersected with broader historical currents. Some groups moved toward emerging towns or trade centers, contributing to urban growth. Others joined military campaigns or religious movements, influencing political and cultural developments. The interplay of survival instinct and social bonds shaped the experience of flight. Decisions to leave or stay were deeply personal, influenced by family ties, faith, and hopes for the future. The role of religion remained vital during migration. Pilgrimages and prayers accompanied journeys. Monasteries along routes offered refuge and spiritual support. Belief in divine protection sustained many through perilous travels. The memory of migration shaped collective consciousness. Songs, legends, and commemorations honored those who fled or perished. These narratives reinforced values of endurance, loyalty, and faith. In examining survivors in migration, we see a testament to human will amid catastrophe. These journeys across frozen landscapes reveal the intersection of environment, society, and identity in medieval Eastern Europe's darkest winters. As winter's grip loosened, many migrants returned home or settled permanently elsewhere, carrying with them the scars and stories of survival. Their movements left an indelible mark on the region's history and culture. In the merciless winters of medieval Eastern Europe, survival was a cruel lottery. For many villagers, the frozen death meant one fate: flight. When frost and famine made staying impossible, desperate families and communities chose to abandon their homes, braving the unknown in search of refuge, sustenance, and hope. This section explores the harrowing stories of survivors, the perilous journeys they undertook, the formation of migrating groups, and how these movements reshaped the social and demographic landscape of the region. Survival was rarely a solitary endeavor. Entire families, sometimes whole villages, packed what few possessions they could carry and set out into the bleak, snow-covered wilderness. The decision to leave was agonizing, a wrenching break from land, tradition, and the graves of ancestors. Yet remaining meant certain death by hunger, cold, or disease. The first challenge was preparation. Villagers gathered scant supplies, dried bread, salted meat, bits of cloth or blankets, and wrapped themselves in layers to fend off the biting cold. Elders and children were especially vulnerable, requiring extra care. Many left behind livestock or heavy belongings, choosing mobility over material comfort. As groups moved, the terrain itself became a relentless adversary. Frozen rivers and treacherous ice sheets posed dangers of collapse. Dense forests blocked paths and concealed threats. Snowstorms could separate members, leaving the lost to perish or wander aimlessly. Hunger stalked every step, forcing scavenging and rationing amid scarcity. Migration routes often followed ancient paths, trade routes, or rivers, hoping for settlements or hospitable territories. Travelers sought friendly villages, monasteries, or lordships offering food and shelter. But reception was mixed. Some communities welcomed survivors, sharing resources and protection. Others feared disease or competition and turned them away. The size and composition of migrating groups varied. Some were small family units, moving stealthily to avoid bandits or hostile neighbors. Others were larger caravans, with dozens or even hundreds traveling together for safety. These groups formed makeshift communities on the move, sharing labor, defense, and morale. Danger was ever present. Bandits exploited the chaos, raiding vulnerable migrants. Wolves and other predators attacked the weak. Exposure led to frostbite, hypothermia, and death. Illness spread quickly in cramped conditions. Many perished before reaching safety. Despite hardships, stories of courage and solidarity abound. Elders guided younger generations. Women tended the sick. Men cleared paths or hunted small game. Mutual aid was crucial to survival. Songs, prayers, and stories helped maintain hope amid despair. Historical records and archaeological evidence reveal traces of these migrations. Abandoned villages and cemeteries mark points of departure or tragedy. Monastic chronicles recount pilgrim-like journeys seeking sanctuary. Oral traditions preserve tales of lost kin and heroic escapes. These migrations had lasting demographic impacts. Regions receiving survivors sometimes experienced population growth and cultural blending, while depopulated areas faced economic and social decline. Land ownership shifted as abandoned farms reverted to wilderness or were claimed by others. Politically, mass movements strained local authorities. Lords struggled to accommodate influxes or maintain order. Some used migrants as labor or soldiers. Others imposed heavy taxes or restrictions. Refugee crises could spark tension or conflict between groups. The psychological toll on migrants was immense. Trauma from loss, fear of the unknown, and harsh conditions left deep scars. Yet survival also fostered resilience and adaptability. Communities forged new identities and social networks in their adopted homes. Migration stories also intersected with broader historical currents. Some groups moved toward emerging towns or trade centers, contributing to urban growth. Others joined military campaigns or religious movements, influencing political and cultural developments. The interplay of survival instinct and social bonds shaped the experience of flight. Decisions to leave or stay were deeply personal, influenced by family ties, faith, and hopes for the future. The role of religion remained vital during migration. Pilgrimages and prayers accompanied journeys. Monasteries along routes offered refuge and spiritual support. Belief in divine protection sustained many through perilous travels. The memory of migration shaped collective consciousness. Songs, legends, and commemorations honored those who fled or perished. These narratives reinforced values of endurance, loyalty, and faith. In examining survivors in migration, we see a testament to human will amid catastrophe. These journeys across frozen landscapes reveal the intersection of environment, society, and identity in medieval Eastern Europe's darkest winters. As winter's grip loosened, many migrants returned home or settled permanently elsewhere, carrying with them the scars and stories of survival. Their movements left an indelible mark on the region's history and culture.